All right. Hello and welcome to Diversity and Cultural Competency Skills. Today we're going to be talking more about understanding and unraveling implicit bias or implicit biases. This is actually a very important part about developing cultural competence and developing diversity and cultural competency skills. So again, like I said, I've kind of veered completely away from the book. I still want you to read it because you are in schools and that book really does a nice job covering some cultural variations. But I feel like if that's what the book is going to offer, then it's my job to do the work of let's address our own cultural competency skills, because it's more than just knowing differences. It's about engaging in some evolution of your own thought. So first, let me go to the agenda. So we're going to talk, obviously, course updates and reminders. And we're going to watch a video kind of just wrapping up what is implicit bias. Then I want to give you a story about one of my own. And then we're going to move into kind of the effects of implicit bias and how to unravel it. I want to talk about equality versus equity because unaddressed implicit bias can lead to this thought that equality is what we aspire to have, and that's not really what me as a teacher would think is appropriate. And there are good reasons for that. And then we're going to talk about this idea of building capacity and unraveling our biases. And then we'll do our wrap up and exit ticket. All right, so first, weekly expectations. Again, I'm probably going to start on a Friday schedule now that I've had a hard time getting things done sooner, and I apologize, but it's a busy time of year. So watch the lecture recording. You have until next Friday to complete your exit ticket. The discussion board was posted on Tuesday. You have until Monday to complete that. And although the quiz, you have until the 15th. Change that. Ignore that. That is incorrect. They were posted on Tuesday. And as always, you have your regular course requirements. So the field assignment, timesheets, evaluation, final reflection, chapter quizzes, which are due in December. And then the final exam, I just want you to be aware of the fact that, yes, you have 2 parts, but I am not going to wait to give those to you. I'm going to create, part 1 is based on quizzes. So if you have done your quizzes, and if I have to grade quizzes 1 through 8, after I do that, I'm going to create the exam. It's not going to be just on that information, but just be aware that what you've done in the quizzes is going to be reflected in your final exam. Because that's been my learning tool. I don't like using quizzes, but I think if I can focus on certain parts, then you'll likely remember them. 12, 121, ignore that too. And then part 2 is actually going to be open-ended. So I'm going to make that available on the 15th, and it will be more short and a little bit more based on what I've talked about in these lectures and what you've done in your classrooms. All right, let's review and recap. Do we understand implicit bias? Let's see.
You may have heard the term implicit bias before, but what is it? Why does it happen? And how does it show up in our lives and world? Implicit biases are essentially thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Basically, mental shortcuts and judgments that occur in both positive and negative ways, some of which you might not even agree with. These biases stem from very normal mental functioning and exposure to things like the media, news, our education, and any type of experience with others. Think of these experiences as having an invisible effect on how your brain gets wired, something you are unaware of as it happens. This wiring creates mental associations that lead to biases because of the cycle of socialization. Consider this. When you hear peanut butter, your mind likely goes to jelly. Despite peanut butter and jelly being completely independent from one another, we all associate them in this way because we constantly see them represented together. We all have associations like this that we haven't intentionally created. But it's important to understand that not all of our implicit biases are as innocuous as peanut butter and jelly. These biases too often shape the language we use and the ways we interact with others, based on race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, and other cultural identities. This cycle of socialization can lead to microaggressions, stereotypes, discrimination, and even violence. These unintended sentiments that are embedded within the cycle's socialization are built around a culture of white supremacy that we must continually acknowledge, confront, dismantle, and disrupt to advance the work of racial and social justice. We know that to advance racial and social justice, we must be willing to challenge our implicit bias by confronting the biases in our own lives. Just as our brains have been wired to create these unjust associations, it can also be unwired as you confront and disrupt the process by questioning your assumptions, educating yourself, and taking a stand. At the NEA, we challenge you to stay engaged, dig deeper, and ignite your passion for racial and social justice in our world, communities, and schools.
So basically, I like that one because it really very quickly sums up implicit bias and what happens when they go unchecked. I want to give you kind of a story of mine, and I realize I might need to set something else up. So I'm going to pause for a second. So this is taken from another PowerPoint I did because I've taught this course before in other situations. So what are my biases? I'm going to give you a little background about me. So, sorry, my animations weren't working. So that's me, little white girl, grew up in New Hampshire, grew up in a little town called Hampstead, where it is 98% white. Oh, look at all those white people. However, in my town, because it was 98% white, the separation was more class-based. There weren't really people of different colors or ethnicities, but there were people of different classes. And even though, and this is very odd to me that this is how it happened, my parents, although both carry graduate degrees, which is almost always a sign of higher status, we did not live that way. And my dad actually insisted on telling me we were lower middle class. And so I often associated more with the lower class in my town. And I felt alienated from the higher class people. And what most of this was about was because many of the parents in my classes worked for these big companies as engineers like Raytheon and Lucent, which things changed in the late 90s for those families. But at that time, that's kind of how I was raised. And I kind of became very resentful of the people I grew up with in this corner because I felt like I was othered. And that's what this is really all about, the feeling of being othered. And also where the feeling of being othered, or the feelings and what your parents also communicate to you. So now, fast forward to me being a teaching assistant in a place, well, let me get back to being a teaching assistant for UNC Chapel Hill, which is a mostly white, though more diverse institution than UNH, but mostly white, a lot of people who are in the upper middle class. And what I noticed when I was grading is I was very hard on students I perceived, be very careful here, perceived, because my opinions were based on the people I grew up with who looked a certain way. I perceived these white upper middle class people and I graded hard on them. Whereas my lower middle or working class, I was much more forgiving. And after some brutal teaching evaluations, I realized that wasn't good. I need to fix my practice. Because even if someone has had privilege, that doesn't mean we have the right to treat them unjustly. And I do believe in giving more understanding and flexibility to students who come from those backgrounds, but that doesn't mean I have the right to assume that someone is from a different background, because that's what I was doing. I didn't know for sure. I just made my assumptions based on appearance. So it became very clear to me that I needed to fix my own bias. Now, that example probably makes me look better because I am biased against people who look like me, but it also it's an unfair assumption I make when I don't even think, when I'm looking based on the book by the cup, like I'm looking at the cover. Okay. And that's what people most often will do. Let me go back to my original PowerPoint. So again, there's my story. Again, need to fix my practice. So that is kind of a wrap up on what implicit bias is and my own example of my implicit biases. I do think that partly from growing up in such a white place and having one parent who had this distinct opinion on programs like affirmative action, and then moving to a place where I saw that the starting line for many students was behind, I realized there is this true inequity in our country. So let's talk about that now. Because oftentimes implicit bias, so my dad held this implicit bias that everyone starts at the same point and can pull themselves up from their bootstraps, right? I'm sure you've heard that. Sadly, it leads to something like this. People don't seem to understand the difference between equality and equity. If you haven't, here's one picture that shows what equality is. Everyone gets the same thing regardless of who they are. Now let's look at equity. We compare these three people and provide what they need. So this girl needed 2 boxes, but this young boy in a wheelchair actually needed a ramp. Otherwise, he couldn't see at all. That's a picture example. I like this video because it uses plants. And I think that's another nice way of talking about just the pure concepts of equity versus equality.
What is the difference between equity and equality? Everyone wants to live in a world where all of our needs are met. But there is a difference between treating people equally and treating people equitably. Equality is when everyone is treated the same, but not everyone is the same. Their needs are different, and that's why it's best if they are treated equitably. Equality and equity have the same goal: fairness. What does fairness mean to you?
Fairness.
Not all plants need the same amount of water to grow. Cacti can survive on very little, but the lily of the valley needs lots. If we give all kinds of plants the same amount of water, some will drown and some will dry out. But this idea isn't just important to plants. In the classroom, every student is different. Some kids need lots of help from their teachers to master a subject. Advanced students are able to complete tasks on their own, but still need feedback from their teacher. How should teachers divide their time between the two? If they do so equally, the first group of students will suffer. But if they do so equitably, spending a little more time with the students who need more help, the class as a whole will achieve better results. When do you think it's unfair to treat everyone the same? We've heard about the difference between equality and equity and why it's important that plants and students receive enough of what they need to survive and thrive. Which is more fair, treating everyone the same or giving everyone what they need?
And I like that because I think that's the best way to kind of understand the difference between equality and equity. What I like about this image is it shows what our world really is or what it needs. The reality is people do not all start at the same place. And there's another image where we have a slanted, actually it's slanted in this direction, a slanted fence that shows that it's not even that everyone is starting with the same thing. A lot of people are starting behind. And we saw that with the video I showed last week of the students who they all started at the starting line, but then some were given more steps forward based on some of these environmental things in their lives that they had no control over. And that's the case with the reality. Equality here when everyone gets the same, equity here, and then the idea of justice is when everyone sees the gains without support. Because we know that the cause of these inequities is often systemic barriers. Okay. I think this is a very important concept to understand, not just when we're talking about diversity and cultural competence, but if you're in a classroom and there are children with a range of different abilities, very similar in that we cannot provide equal materials because not everyone will have ready access to content. So let's kind of work on this idea of equality to equity in the classroom, since many of you are there right now. So some statements, this first statement is based on equality. Everyone in Miss Reed's first grade class sits at a desk to read. I have to pause, hold on. All right, so everyone in Miss Reed's first grade class sits at a desk to read. Sorry about that hammering. My partner is working on some stuff in the house because he has the day off. A more equitable statement is all students in Miss Reed's first grade class are provided comfortable seating. So this undergirds the fact that we know not all children are comfortable in the same type of seating or can succeed in the same type of seating. So making sure all children are provided seating that leads them to success. Mr. Beaumont spends 5 minutes practicing phonemic awareness with each student. So that's similar to the end of the video we just watched where we are just dividing our time equally. Mr. Beaumont spends 5 minutes working with small groups of students with developmentally expected phonemic awareness skills, and then 5 minutes working individually with students who are struggling. So here we're actually providing students equal time, just not maybe the same type of attention, because we know that their peers, if they are showing expected skills, their peers can also support them as opposed to just us. This isn't just saying that we're not providing equal attention or equitable attention. I mean, really, I know a lot of parents would be upset if they heard that one student gets 20 minutes and one student gets 5, but it doesn't mean they're not receiving what they need to be successful. And that's where you want to move with that. I love this name. Mrs. Fiddlesticks reminds all students to raise their hands before answering a question in her 4th grade class. I don't like this because I know students who can't do that. So Mrs. Fiddlesticks provides time for students to raise hands and answer a question and calls on students who are unable to raise hands. Or it could be provides different ways for students to indicate that they want to share the answer. So with my students who were learning to raise hands, I used an actual object to help them with it. Or if there are students who can't, and sometimes we have to allow call out and just be flexible with what we do for each student. All students in Mr. Gorski's algebra class must complete an in-class midterm exam in their classroom. And we know this isn't going to happen in high school. Some students in Mr. Gorski's algebra class complete an in-person exam in their classroom. Some are placed in a small, quiet room with support from a teaching assistant, and others are allowed a few class sessions to complete the test. I'm not certain that would happen in high school, but I want to believe that it would because that's the most appropriate. So here we're starting on first understanding that I know it's hard to understand how this is linked, but a lot of people believe that if we give equal access, everyone should have the ability to get that same thing because their experience has shown that people who don't, it's because they're just not trying hard. Well, let's think about that a little bit more deeply and thinking about equity versus equality, and that actually to eliminate the impact of bias, we need to provide equitable supports for all of our students. And now let's talk about the work of fixing, actually fixing. So now we understand being equitable and providing resources to students. Now we have to start building capacity. So here's another definition of cultural competence that I've used in my classes before. But I just wanted to bring us back to what it is, having a set of congruent behaviors, knowledge, attitudes, and policies that come together in a system, organization. Again, this could be just for you, that enables effective working. So I can work across cultures with students. Understanding that culture encompasses a lot of different things, patterns of behavior that include language, thoughts, actions, institutions, etc. And then competence is the capacity to function effectively based on within an individual or within that context. Hold on. This was supposed to be, I'm going to do something quickly. Good. All right, sorry. So building capacity is a term we use a lot in courses like this, because I'm trying to build capacity within you to be able to use these new skills and use this new knowledge and skills to be a culturally competent professional. And it usually is me developing cultural competence to support diverse individuals to you. This is how we fix unconscious bias, recognizing our own self-identities, the ways those identities develop, that we possess implicit biases in what they are, and then learning about the many other representations of identity. And we've been doing that, right? We've been learning about identity, implicit biases. We've been learning about, I shared with you how my own identity was developed, and accepting that I do have these implicit biases. That's an important step. And building capacity is part of the work towards disabling our unconscious or implicit bias. So steps to fix it. So first, it's a process. We have to recognize some of our stereotypical thinking, catch ourselves when that bias arises, and then begin training our mind to notice the exceptions to the stereotypes, which means you might need to immerse yourself and expand exposure to these groups. So if you are someone who is white and you have never been the only person of a specific race in the room, so until I moved to North Carolina, actually, had really never understood that feeling of being the only white person in the room. And I moved to North Carolina where there's a larger Black and African American population, and I actually felt that. And it was an interesting feeling to realize that the cultural norms I had developed in my home were not really super appropriate for that setting. And also seeking out literature, media, art, whatever you can, seeking out products that are created by these populations, celebrating these populations, watch some interesting documentaries that might provide a lens into their perspective and then might expand your own views on maybe your own identity. So in short, when we recognize the bias, we then substitute that. We substitute with new information that we learned. Doing this is ongoing and it takes a lot of work. You have to be mindful, you have to reflect, and you have to be committed to it. So one way we can do that is by practicing reframing our thinking. So this is an activity where we are going to practice seeing the whole person. And really, this is more for you to understand how just language can impact making someone feel othered. So I'm going to kind of preview and then tell you how we might fix it to put the person back in. Because sometimes a lot of these biases are perpetuated by the language we use to define people. And then we put people into these categories that they don't actually belong. So here's one. The psychotics are in Ward 1. I don't think anyone would ever use that, but the people, or people with psychological disorders who are receiving mental health treatments or additional mental health support, are in Ward 1. So we're putting the person back and not identifying them as this thing that is typically very negative. After 2 hours of negotiation, the perpetrator was apprehended. This one's a little trickier, but it's more about let's not assume before trial because we are innocent until proven guilty in this country. So we say the person who is allegedly accused of the crime was apprehended. Next. This one is silly. He was seen at the premiere with a blonde. He was seen at the premiere with a blonde on each arm. There's definitely an issue with that because there's a stereotype of people who are blonde being not as intelligent. He came to the premiere with friends on each arm. He came to the premiere with 2 people accompanying him, or it could be 3 people attended a premiere. Do we need to out the one gentleman in this? Oh, crud. Sorry, I forgot to do that one. So the original is even though she was liberal and he was conservative, they got along pretty well. So here we're basically telling people that that is their identity, is that they're liberal. So instead, we'd say she identified as liberal and him as conservative, but they interacted well, even though they had different political views, which I think is a little bit more about people. They got along well. All right, this one's interesting. We are being led by the blind. This one is not great because it's definitely suggesting that people who are blind can't navigate. Instead, we are being led by people who are unsure of where they are going, because that's what we mean, so let's just say it. And the idea of these exercises is we're trying not to, when we identify people by these labels, then that becomes who they are, and it might not be who they want to be. Or if we use these labels in a derogatory meaning, we're making assumptions about these people. So we could be making assumptions that blind people can't navigate, which might not be true. They can't see. That doesn't mean they can't navigate. So that's just why I wanted to do, we're going to do more exercises like this. This was similar to your discussion board assignment. But I thought it would be good for us to do this together, or at least over the lecture, so you can see why this is important and how you can do it yourself. How did we do? So that's all I have for you today. I realize I didn't put a wrap up slide, so hold on, I'm going to do that now. Because I don't want to forget about that. Yeah. So here, let's do our wrap up. What did we talk about? So we watched a video explaining implicit bias and then reviewed an example of my own. We discussed equality versus equity, and how this can contribute to implicit bias. And we talked about building capacity and unlearning and the steps to unlearning implicit bias. And then we reviewed examples of phrases that identify people by categories they might by categories that are negative or not true to who they are, and put the person back in the statement. All right. So with that, please take some time to complete your exit ticket. And that is all I have. Thank you so much for a wonderful day.